Esoteric Psychology 2. This seminar continues the Introduction to Esoteric Psychology. It is assumed that you have either attended those sessions or read the corresponding classes as an introduction to this subject. These meetings will unfold in a circular fashion. In this first session, we will introduce certain concepts and develop them to a specific point, only to return later to the beginning of these themes. We will revisit them in order to amplify them in ever-widening arcs. In this sense, we will progress circularly, repeating the same topics in each meeting at different levels of depth. In these subject matters, one cannot advance linearly. If we were to open up a territory too far in a linear direction, it would produce a powerful reaction that would put a cap on the conversation, causing it to spin aimlessly or speculatively. Therefore, we must accustom ourselves to advancing to a certain point, stopping and returning, moving forward and returning once more, spiraling upward creatively. Understanding the methodology of our conversation is part of the conversation itself. Realizing that in these matters one cannot advance linearly is fundamental to understanding the subject. There is a psychological or vibratory reason why we must converse in circles. The false stability of the ego. Let us begin by stating that we humans, in our current state, are highly unstable beings of very low energy. The psychic process studied by what we call esoteric psychology leads to a human being of high stability, possessing the capacity to move within a level of energy that is unimaginable from the perspective of our current psychological state. I will use these two concepts, stability and high energy. First, we must become aware that in our current state, we are very unstable beings living in low vibration, moving in a constant search for external security. Initially, a large part of humanity reached a first level of stability, which is the stability granted to us by the ego. But in reality, a stable ego does not exist. The psychic organization centered on the ego is a highly unstable psychological state. Therefore, it is nothing more than an intermediate station within our potential for psychic evolution. We have the possibility of achieving a high degree of stability, but this is not possible if the psyche is organized around the ego. The ego needs to cling to external constructions, to identify with something in order to feel secure. In itself, it expresses a high degree of internal instability. That is, a psychic state based on continuous cycles of action and reaction that must inevitably discharge through external conflicts. Interaction of vibratory levels. The global context of this conversation is to investigate the activity of the universe that arises from the interaction between different planes of vibration. Within these planes, everything we call matter represents a very dense level of low energy. When I refer to matter, I include thought in this term. I am speaking of the vehicle, emotions, thoughts, and the ego. All of this is matter in terms of energy at a relatively low vibration. These levels of low-energy substances have the characteristic of refracting and polarizing subtler vibrations. They are incapable of absorbing them. There is an incessant activity inherent to material intelligence, which in other seminars we have called manas, following the Sanskrit denomination. This activity unfolds across a series of levels that share a specific characteristic. They cannot respond fully, but only react fragmentarily to the subtler levels of vibration that we might call non-material. Of course, throughout our conversation, language will be a continuous obstacle, and that is why we will return to this point. The densest levels of activity and vibration cannot respond creatively to subtler levels. Due to their inherent restlessness, they fall prey to an incessant activity expressed in extremely long sequences of action and reaction. These sequences overlap with one another, generating phenomena of interference and polarization that refract the subtlest vibrations. If we observe ourselves carefully, we can see that our compulsive, instinctive vital pulses, our basically reactive emotional system, our restless and hyperactive thought, constitute a system in a state of incessant and almost frenetic activity. Our vitality constantly drives us to satisfy desires, forcing us to act, or rather, to react to unconscious programming and stimuli. Our intense emotional responses govern our thoughts, dragging them along. This prevents the flowering of sensors capable of capturing and responding to subtler vibrations, which remain in a potential or latent state within our psyche. We will emphasize the human being as a restless substance, incapable of quieting itself, constantly seeking to cling to objects, both concrete and virtual. Consequently, it cannot remain in a solidly receptive state for long. This incessant restlessness prevents qualities that exist in a potential state within us from blooming. It is as if we were to sow flowers in a field full of horses. The seeds are in the field, but they can never bloom. That is to say, a basic activity has become hypertrophied, systematically destroying the possible emergence of the subsequent levels of the process. The more mature psychic levels latent within us are inhibited by the incessant activity of those that precede them. Therefore, it is a matter of leading the horses to a place where they cannot trample the flowers. I say this so that we do not think the horses must be killed. It is not a question of destroying the previous process, but of positioning it in such a way that it does not interfere or impede the development of latent levels of response to subtle energy, thereby allowing the human entity to resonate with other levels of reality. More concretely, we can say that the evolution of the Earth's substance has generated our brain and our nervous system, a reticular material substance capable of serving as a vehicle for energy. As far as we know, our nervous system is the subtlest and most sensitive matter on planet Earth. But that reticular system has the potential to respond to non-material vibrations and consequently to act in response to extremely subtle dynamics. However, that capacity is interfered with by the hyperactivity of the previous levels, characterized by restlessness. And when I refer to restlessness, I am even speaking of so-called spiritual desires, the bubble of human vibration. This is the restlessness inherent to the whirlpools formed in the disordered confluence of bioelectric, etheric levels, which impel us to act blindly. It is the restlessness of the astral level, or the sensory imaginary desiring currents of human psychic energy. The restlessness of the collective currents of thought that seize control of brain activity, which is continuously stimulated and incapable of stopping. The brain cannot stop thinking. The emotional level responds mechanically to collective, archetypal, psychic currents. And the etheric level leads us to act by satisfying desires that stem from deep programming and unconscious images. This global psychic state closes in upon itself like a bubble, rendering it incapable of responding to other states. Visualize this closed sphere in which we live, filled with our own vibrations, our desires, our archetypal images and emotional currents, our incessant thought, whether superficial, intellectual, or technical scientific. All of this constitutes a conglomerate of vibrations that create a true refractory barrier to that which is subtler. They reduce our sensitivity to what occurs within the bubble and prevent us from registering any information that goes beyond it. As we know, and as we discussed in the previous seminar, within this set of vibrations, interactions occur that are ultimately mechanical. They respond to archetypal chains, to currents of ideas and images, and to patterns of circulation that tend to repeat themselves over and over again. In that repetition, the little energy we have is consumed. It is what we have called the torrent, in the sense of a desiring drift that closes in on itself and drags us into a single collective whirlpool, regardless of how diversified its appearance may seem. Within this sphere, or triple sphere, there is a lot of energy. Eventually, a human organism capable of capturing a great deal of this type of energy will appear, and therefore it seems as though it possesses or moves a lot of energy. Indeed, it does. But it is a great deal of low vibration energy. A strong personality has a lot of low-level energy, but its dynamics prevent the development of other levels that are implied in our psyche. In fact, initially, we do not even believe that other levels exist. We have said that the profound meaning of psychic evolution is to reach the point where truly stable organisms develop. Stable means they are no longer losing energy within this web or whirlpool because they no longer feel compelled to act, feel, or think according to collective currents. Instead, they have managed to neutralize the spell of those currents. Consequently, those organisms have more energy at their disposal, and thanks to that, what remains latent in others can finally bloom within them. Networked organisms. Now we can open a second level of reflection regarding the psychic process. The action of stable organisms, those in which higher levels have flourished, attracts and resonates with subtle energy levels. Consequently, these organisms can introduce these energies into the dynamics of human restlessness, which we have called the torrent. These more stable human beings, who possess greater energy, can interact with one another and with others, not according to the archetypal patterns triggered in our mechanical relationality, but based on choreographies that mirror subtler levels of reality. Our current interactions are conditioned by the dynamics of the torrent. Our relationships are, in classical terms, personality-based. They are not relationships of the soul. We will occasionally use these classical terms to temporarily understand one another, only to redefine them later. Our relationships are external and mechanical. They respond to predictable, archetypal patterns, and these choreographies prevent deeper bonds from being established between us. In contrast, relational networks constituted by stable human beings activate choreographies with the potential to generate a more complex type of entity, networked organisms. Until now, we can only speak of individual organisms existing in symbiotic groupings or slightly differentiated within the framework of institutions and organizations. The flowering of the deep psychic process first generates individual entities of high stability and high energy. In a second step, it allows for the flowering of true networked organisms, interactive sets of fully developed individuals who have the capacity to generate resonance phenomena capable of attracting even more vibration to continue the creative process of planetary life. Question: how can the previous dynamics coexist with the new ones? Carutti: investigating how these two dynamics coexist is the very purpose of this entire conversation. For now, we can put it this way. For an excited human, and by this I include a personality like that of Borges, someone whose mind is in constant activity and filled with knowledge, images, and words, however beautiful they may seem, not just the leader of a rowdy football crowd, it is practically impossible to comprehend this coexistence. I am including those human beings we do not usually consider excited. For a permanently excited organism, understanding this coexistence only occurs to the extent that this excitation ceases, at least cyclically. This new receptivity allows other levels of information processing to emerge. That is why, having reached this point, we are going to pause and return to the beginning of our conversation. We need a series of insights to occur before proceeding, so as not to enter a theoretical or speculative process. Bear in mind that everything I am saying may sound like science fiction or spiritual processes belonging to exceptional beings. However, I want to lead you to consider, simply as a hypothesis, that this is a natural and possible psychological process of which we are a part. It is inherent to the nature of planet Earth to develop entities of this type. Understanding this as a natural process is what allows the so-called spiritual to free itself from any sense of exceptionality and understand itself as the possible unfolding of the human being. The limits of matter. When we say natural process, we are not referring to a natural process of matter, but to a natural cosmic process. This level of the psychic process is the result of the coupling of vibrations that lie beyond matter with the vibrations inherent to matter itself. That is what is natural. It is not natural for matter to go beyond matter on its own. What matter can do is learn to respond to that which lies beyond it. It can quiet itself in response to what is beyond. But nothing material can enter other planes, not because it is forbidden by some particular design, but because it is not in its nature. It is as if the liver wanted to study mathematics. It is not in its nature to do so, though it can form part of a larger being that eventually studies mathematics, a being in which that liver actively collaborates without being conscious of it at all. In this other level of organisms, humans forming creative networks, it is not necessary for the components to be at the same psychological evolutionary stage. It is only necessary that they be capable of integrating at different levels, just as the human vehicle is a system integrated by different levels of biological complexity. The brain also possesses this structure in which different evolutionary layers coexist. Roughly, it has a reptilian level, a limbic level, purely animal-mammal, and the frontal cortex. It is learning to function as best it can as a complex organ that includes different levels of development within itself. It is this interaction between different levels of development that creates new totalities in organisms of a new level of complexity. For the human being to stabilize and calm down profoundly in order to respond to new levels of vibration, they must learn to respond to the vibration of love. Matter does not generate love, matter can only respond to it. Progressive quieting allows the sensors capable of registering the energy of love to flourish, as an intelligence and sensitivity of enormous complexity. And that is the only thing that truly calms the system. When we say energy of love, this will appear to us at first as something philosophical or spiritual. But the philosophical and spiritual are merely sets of ideas. In deep psychic inquiry, we must face realities. Esoteric psychology implies an absolutely different understanding of human psychic dynamics, an understanding that is even disturbing and perhaps dangerous for the majority of human beings. However, it is necessary that we set out to understand these processes in natural terms and not in terms of exceptionality or superior beings. Scientific psychology and esoteric psychology. Ultimately, our conversation leads us to think that the phases included in esoteric psychology lie far beyond what we call normal. Modern psychology conceives of the human being in terms of an individual within a social framework who learns not to respond mechanically to the requirements of the collective, which it calls the unconscious, at any of its various levels. It thinks of psychological development within the torrent, or what in previous seminars, according to classical terminology, we called the three worlds. Here we propose to investigate activity in the three worlds, vehicle emotions, thought, in terms of a dynamic that lies far beyond the torrent. The psychology hitherto called esoteric conceives of human planetary development in terms of the encounter between vibrations, some moving in a material direction and others in an amorphous, subtle, or higher frequency direction. Scientific psychology thinks within the human bubble. Esoteric psychology visualizes the psychic process as a vibratory interaction that the human being, identified with the bubble of etheric astral mental currents we have called the torrent, cannot understand. We humans in the torrent fantasize about and imagine that interaction, projecting our own constructions onto it, but we do not perceive it directly. What we are saying is that psychic dynamics respond to an interactive process between different dimensions of the universe. By saying this, we are putting the anxieties, passions, fantasies, and longings characteristic of the relatively early phases of this process, with which we are currently identified, into proportion. Now we could speak of the interactive process between different dimensions of the universe, or, equally validly, of the interactive process between different dimensions of being. But what happens within us when we use these words? If we say universe, associations with a material correlate are produced in our minds. We are somehow including the spatial in the sense that I am referring to the terrestrial process, the solar system process, the cosmic process, something that has a physical image. The word being, and on the other hand, refers us to something metaphysical. It refers us to non-physical dimensions. The inherent difficulties of language. In this example, the problem of language reveals itself. We must be able to describe this in two ways and realize that we should do so simultaneously. We possess no single word to express both things at once. If we did, it would mean we had understood this process. If we had a word that could signify universe, in the sense of planet Earth, the solar system, and the cosmos, and at the same time signify being, in the sense of distinct dimensions in varying degrees of vibration, it would mean that synthetic symbolic levels had been activated in our brains, allowing for a different kind of communication. The languages active within us force us to think in terms of numerous opposites: matter versus non-matter, dense energy versus subtle energy. Divisions or separations continually appear in the mind. Later, when we must account for a process that is non-divisive, because language introduced divisions first, we attempt to reunite them through complex explanations that ultimately confuse us. The central point for us is not the explanations, but paying attention to the level from which we are listening. From one perspective, the entire logic of the process is a sequence of differentiations and couplings. However, the mechanical activity of the material level does not tolerate differentiation. It requires separation to function in an organized manner. In the psychology characteristic of the torrent, the human being first needs to learn to make extremely sharp distinctions. Later, in the terrain of esoteric psychology, we need to learn to make subtle differentiations, always remaining within the unity. To differentiate and to distinguish is not the same as to separate and to sever. Esoteric psychology investigates an interaction of vibrations in which differentiations occur that couple effectively with one another, yet do not produce separations. Our minds need to separate the vehicle, emotions, and thought. In reality, these three levels form a single system. But if we do not separate them, we become confused. Therefore, we first separate them very clearly, and then we attempt to reunite them with explanations that become too complicated and, we must admit, even absurd. In reality, we do not need to learn how to reunite what has been separated, but how to differentiate and couple correctly. Question: it is not just a mental process. Carutti: what we must investigate is that what we call a mental process is also a vibratory process, a specific level of vibration within a set of levels, the necessary psychic maturity. Etymologically, the word individual means undivided, which is something completely different from what we typically understand by the term. From the perspective of our research, the individual, as a being separated from other human beings, is an illusion belonging to a separative level of vibration. In reality, what exists are undivided human beings and human beings in a state of fragmentation. Question: they are particles of the universe. Carutti: they are undivided in both horizontal and vertical terms. Now, what does undivided mean? It means that the level hegemonizing the psychic process is based on a non-divisive perception. It functions healthily by differentiating, but not separating. In contrast, within the torrent, I must separate myself to function healthily. If I do not feel I am separate, I become undiscriminated, undifferentiated. I lose myself. We enter into regressive states. In the process of differentiation, from the animal, the mother, or society, we need to pass through a stage of clear separation between inside and outside. We know, and this is what we have researched through the study of astrology, that this sharp separation leads to countless illusions and conflicts. The process of psychological maturation leads us to discover that what we call inside and outside in the early psychic phases is merely a distinction, not a total separation. There is a clear continuity between what happens in the psyche and what happens outside of it, an indivisible wave between the psychic process and the events of existence. There is an integrated order between what appears outside of what we call the subject and what the subject perceives as their inner world. Obviously, if we tell this to a 4-year-old child, it will cause problems. The child needs to differentiate and organize their own center. However, this necessary activity later crystallizes into the idea sensation that they are separate from everything else and that this center is unique, permanent, and unalterable. Later, some may develop the idea that separation is an illusion, but this does not mean our psychic state actually allows us to function in a real state of differentiation rather than separation. As we know, if the idea of non-separation is cultivated without understanding, our psychic organization may likely begin to falter, leading to delusional constructs. When the separative level starts developing ideas about reuniting what it has severed without truly understanding itself, it tends to enter more or less delusional states. Question: it no longer differentiates. Carutti: it begins to confuse things. Question: this requires significant psychic maturity. Carutti: that is exactly what we are referring to. This psychic maturity implies questioning a series of ideas that were useful in earlier stages, which organize our perception and are perfectly healthy in other circumstances. In the subsequent phases of the process, it becomes necessary to question what was healthy at an earlier time. Therefore, this is a risky phase. This is the complexity of it. In this sense, the spiritual process or human psychic maturation is not a voluntary process. It involves the flowering of a new psychic organization, not the achievement of certain goals from within the old organization. Therefore, a central point of the process involves the dissolution or the quieting of the level that functions by separating. As an idea, it is about questioning the illusion of separativity. But using only that idea, separative thought continues to build and eventually becomes confused. It is quite another thing to comprehend these ideas and discover the level that generates them. Question. It implies a level of abstraction. Carutti. To a point, yes. But let us not hear this simply as moving from the concrete to the abstract. In reality, it means learning to perform a completely new movement. Thought is conditioned by form. Thought is a constant fitting, seeking and fitting, recognizing and fitting, remembering and fitting. Sight and sound. Thought correlates with the dominance of sight as our primary sense. Sight as a sense traces very clear borders. It distinguishes forms sharply. It separates. Sight moves among forms and therefore seeks edges. We can say that thought, in a way, inherits the hegemony of this sense. In contrast, hearing does not register in terms of separations, but in terms of couplings and distinctions. C and D, do and re, are not two unmistakable things from the perspective of their form. They are unmistakable from the perspective of their location in a context and above all by their vibration. They have no defined shape or separative edge. Given that as differentiated vibrations, they harmonize or resonate with one another. From the perspective of form, they do not exist. What exists is the key which, when pressed, allows C or D to arise. Thought operates on the plane of the keys, not the notes. It is necessary for another quality to arise, one that is, by analogy, much more auditory than visual. One that can process and compute vibratory information, not simply distinguish and combine forms. The level that computes only forms distinguishes too much, which was necessary in its time. It performs constant games of combination and fitting, in the sense that it distinguishes and later seeks to fit together the pieces it previously defined. It finds it very difficult to establish harmonies, couplings, or resonances because it becomes confused and feels it is losing its rigor. The vibration of love is that which possesses the spontaneous capacity to differentiate intelligently. Love is an intelligence that does not separate. I say this while questioning our habitual use of the word love, which is excessively linked to emotion and sentiment. Here we use it in relation to a very high level of intelligence, a vibration that allows us to register, perceive, and act holistically. Not intelligence as knowledge, which is always recognition, but intelligence as the discovery of the keys to correct action within the action itself, not prior to it. Once we have considered the use of words and concepts linked to separation and differentiation, we are going to use certain words from the esoteric tradition with the aim of finding a new and deeper meaning in them. Evolution and initiation. Let us recall a fundamental concept developed in our previous seminars. The planetary process, what we might call the terrestrial process, is generated by the interaction between two different rhythms. The rhythm of evolution, which is the natural rhythm of the intelligent activity of matter, and the interference with this evolution caused by what we have called initiation. This refers to the emergence of organisms capable of serving as a vehicle for much higher and subtler energy levels, which consequently alter the rhythm of the natural evolutionary process. The interaction between these rhythms and the choreographies arising from them generates everything that happens on Earth. From this perspective, so-called esoteric traditions often use terms such as the human masses, the common human, aspirants, disciples, and initiates. It is evident that if the brain is computed in terms of separation, these words carry a heavy charge. Laughter. This is the point where esotericism becomes distorted. When the separative brain hears this, it begins to draw a series of pathological conclusions. Immediately, the operational side becomes excited and starts measuring itself against others. The average human brain goes no further than that of an adolescent male in the shower after a soccer match with his friends, measuring, cutting, comparing, measuring, cutting, comparing, laughter. The psychological level identified with thought is designed to build. It is made for technological activity, not psychological activity. The function of thought is technological, not psychological, in the sense that it is not an instrument suited to account for the complex dynamics of being. It is, however, suited to give form, to construct, and to create objects. The aforementioned is a standard phraseology in esoteric language. Esoteric books harbor this psychic danger because if read in an incorrect vibratory state, they can trigger feverish conclusions that eventually lead to very complicated psychological outcomes. In reality, at the first level of the psychic process, it is fundamental not to obstruct the listener with ideas that go beyond their current state. This is precisely so that thought may stop and not become excited, filling the entire space, but instead turn back to understand itself. At a certain stage of the process, the essential thing is for thought to understand itself, to realize that it cannot cross over to the other side. In general, if thought is offered images suggesting that which lies beyond form, the unimaginable, it becomes excited and starts building absurd forms. The correct approach is to leave this space empty so that thought, before advancing, retreats. Let it not build forward, but return upon itself to understand itself. There is a risk here, however. Someone will fill that vacuum. The excitement of thought within the torrent will cause someone to write down their fantasies about what lies beyond. For this reason, maps of what lies beyond are sometimes necessary, but they must be treated with great delicacy. If they are not understood literally, they then become a problem. If the books of Alice Bailey had not been written, someone would have filled that space with their fantasies and delusions, and we would be reading even more fantasies and delusions. Every so often, someone takes the risk of drawing what perhaps should not have been drawn, and the risk is this. How do we read or listen to the texts of Alice Bailey or the writings of Sri Aurobindo, for example? Do we do it separatively, or do we listen to them subtly? Question: does the process of consciousness not lead to a separation from cultural conditioning? V. Carutti: inevitably. The psychology we speak of here is an evolutionary psychology with many more stages than the oral, anal, genital, or phallic. Let us understand them as stages of a natural process of differentiation, just like the psychology of puberty, adolescence, and so on. In our inquiry, we will encounter psychological phases just like the stages we have just defined. We must guard against all fantasies telling us that reaching these stages is a matter of merit, the achievement of a goal through the exercise of will, or because some superior being chose us. Unfortunately, our model, our unconscious mold for listening, stems from that language. In this sense, what we call the masses constitutes an evolutionary psychological stage, as does the common human, the aspirant, or the disciple. The various degrees of initiation are different psychic phases within a cosmic process. At the same time, of course, we know those other phases exist, the oral, anal, phallic, etc., as well as genotypic phases such as the reptilian, the mammalian, and so forth. See, I am using these words so that we may remove them from the context of superior-inferior, chosen-not chosen, and especially from the assumption that these are voluntary processes. Question: they are phases of flowering. Carutti: yes. We can say, then, that the initiate phase expresses an organism of high stability in which material dynamics do not interfere with other levels. Therefore, it has a great deal of energy and is capable of anchoring subtle energy on Earth, radiating within it, and eventually creating forms charged with subtle energy. Those forms can be teachings, institutions, and so on. Let us consider these three phases: the masses, the common human, and the aspirant. These are three levels of development in which we humans perform interpretations of reality that are functional for us, in the sense of being protective, but at the same time highly distortive. Initially, the protective interpretation distorts. It veils more complex realities. Question: because it separates. Carutti: because it separates, or rather, because it needs to separate. In previous seminars, we have spoken of interpretation as the reaction of one vibration level to others. Every interpretation is a reaction. In that sense, action is also an interpretation. Question: and it is also a reduction. Carutti: of course, for example, reducing things to very sharp and separative forms in order not to become confused. Question: it annuls complex processes. Carutti: because we are at a stage where the dynamics are exactly that. From this point of view, in that phase, we humans are wrapped in veils or asleep. The so-called initiate is awake. They see what others cannot see because their structure can withstand seeing it, not because someone told them or they accessed some secret manuscript. In contrast, the three levels we indicated before are in a dreamlike state, under multiple veils, because they would completely disorganize if they perceived reality as it truly is. Vibratory activity itself veils. The etheric creates an intensity that clouds everything. Emotional vibration does not allow perception beyond sensory conditioning. The dynamics of thought veil through their symbolic forms, and their interpretations and logics of connection prevent the perception of other dimensions. The stage of the disciple. The stage of the disciple is the state in which an inner process has begun to flower, wherein two completely different interpretations of reality coexist for that human being. Every disciple is someone who oscillates, more or less dramatically, between two practically incompatible perceptions of reality. In one moment, everything acquires clarity, transparency, and lucidity. Energy enters. Reality is seen in a different way, and naturally other behaviors are activated. In a subsequent moment, the old ways return. All the processes characteristic of the sleeping stage are revived, and all interpretations linked to dread, fear of death, possessiveness, jealousy, etc. are updated. You know what we are talking about. Laughter. This is a psychic stage. What interests us is understanding what happens to a human being when this double interpretation begins to occur within them. The stage of the aspirant is one in which only ideas are received, ideas eventually inspired by other dimensions, appealing ideas, ideas that orient them toward a subtler dimension, but it is still a process oriented externally. The ideas directed at aspirants, those coming from initiates or disciples, aim to attract them, not to transform them. The ideas directed at disciples aim to set in motion a true process of transformation. They are seeds that have the capacity to alter them because they are in a phase where it is possible and necessary to undergo that transformation. In the previous seminar, we spoke of the dynamics of the torrent, which moves desire from one object to another, mental objects of desire. What is the difference between the common human and the aspirant? The aspirant has moved toward a set of objects of desire that we might call spiritual. Furthermore, objects of desire that lie beyond the usual religious scope, the esoteric, the mysterious, the exceptional. That object of desire attracts them, but from the outside, because the logic of desire, saturated with reward, punishment, satisfaction, and dissatisfaction, still predominates. Of course, in the disciple, this also manifests cyclically, but this particular regression must be understood as part of their process. Using other analogies, the mass common human aspirant level corresponds to the caterpillar. The initiate level is the butterfly, and the disciple level is the chrysalis. Metaphorically speaking, the caterpillar understands nothing when it begins to turn into a chrysalis. Among other things, this image can serve to re-signify the vertical, separative, hierarchical logic within us. We can appreciate that the marvelous butterfly is the natural destiny of the horrible caterpillar. Its beauty is not an exceptionality disconnected from the previous process. Question: up to Leo, we are caterpillars. In Virgo, we are the chrysalis, and in Libra, we are butterflies. Carutti: moving the metaphor to the zodiac, yes. Another analogy would be aspirant, childhood, puberty, adolescence, youth, disciple, initiate, adulthood. The analogy helps us remember that the disciple is in puberty. That complex moment full of strange reactions linked to the emergence of partial attributes that are not fully understood, where one fantasizes much more than one can act. Let us look at some technicalities that may serve us later, provided you do not look at them but listen to them. Laughter. Do not look at what I write. Listen. The veils. The end of puberty corresponds to what Alice Bailey's books call the first initiation. The end of adolescence corresponds to the second initiation, and the end of youth is what is termed the third initiation. In Bailey's work, you will have noticed that the third initiation is, in reality, the first. These processes, which, in the language of the aspirant, we define as spiritual, must be understood from a certain point in the disciple stage onward, simply as psychological facts. They are planetary psychological processes, not merely human ones. The disciple must learn to pass through a series of veils. These veils are constituted by the vibrations in which we are enveloped. We cannot function healthily beyond them because we cannot tolerate any vibration other than the one with which we are identified. When I say that the disciple must pierce the veils, I mean that throughout the process one must recognize, I am the veil itself. That is, one must develop the capacity to recognize the vibration with which they are currently identified. In truth, it is not that the disciple crosses the veil. Rather, the piercing of the veils is the psychological stage we call discipleship. In a language that invites us to a challenge, we can see them as veils. If we use a more soothing language, we can see it as a flowering, a blooming that implies the opening of a bud and the unfolding of different rows of petals. The bud is simply the veil seen from another perspective. A certain row of petals prevents other dimensions from flourishing. Only if those petals unfold fully will a new series of perceptions appear, which in turn constitute a new veil. Let us turn back. In the mass common human aspirant stages, the dominant constructs are criteria to which humans are obedient: social, religious, moral, philosophical, and scientific criteria. This is the dynamic of society, governed by the standards that arise from it. Eventually, the action of the disciple level and the initiate level operates upon those criteria. Consequently, explanations, rules, behaviors, and conducts change in the direction induced or inspired by them. In the disciple stage, the psyche has quieted enough for another level to appear, a level that was always present, implied within the previous ones. A latent level begins to be consciously registered. It is then that the psychological coexistence of two levels becomes explicit: a more external level conditioned by form and the external interactions of the torrent, and a deeper level that begins to question and reorient the dynamics previously focused outward, including all the religious, moral, and philosophical criteria that belong to the aspirant.